All right. Chapter 7, The Hill of the Strange Trenches. This is from C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. I'm reading The Silver Chair. And let me read the last paragraph of chapter 6. I just like to do that. That way I know what I'm doing. No. So they're looking for the city of the lost giants, but they weren't allowed to begin by looking, so they had to look for it. You're not allowed to begin. Were allowed to begin by looking. The only thing I could do is tongue exercises. They're supposed to find the city of the lost giants, but they kind of argued about whether they're allowed to begin by looking for it rather than just finding it. They had to find it. Well, to find something, you have to look for it, right? So they're looking for the city of lost giants. But they're told about Harfang, which is the city of the gentle giants. That's where they're heading to now. And the two kids, Eustace and Paul, are looking forward to having a bath and food on the table 3 times a day, and a rest from the heat, from the cold, and the greasy, dirty, icky wild game, and the, sleeping on rocks and rough ground, and a lot of other deprivations when you're out in the wilderness. Anyway, some people consider it fun, some people consider it not fun. All right, so here we go. Harfang, cried Scrub and Jill in glad, excited voices. And Harfang, repeated Puddleglum in a dull, gloomy voice. Harfang. But he added, hello, wild geese. And he had the bow off his shoulder in a second. He brought down a good fat goose. It was far too late to think of reaching Harfang that day, but they had a hot meal and a fire, and started the night warmer than they had in over a week. After the fire had gone out, the night grew bitterly cold, and they woke the next morning. When they woke the next morning, their blankets were stiff with frost. Never mind, said Jill, stamping her feet. Hot bath tonight. Okay, so the next chapter is The Hill of the Strange Trenches. There's no denying that it was a beast of a day. Overhead was a sunless sky, muffled in clouds that were heavy with snow. Underfoot, a black frost blowing over it, a wind that felt as if it would take your skin off. When they got down into the plain, they found that this was part of the ancient road. This part of the ancient road was much more ruinous than any they had yet seen. They had to pick their way over great broken stones and between boulders and across rubble. Hard going for sore feet. And however tired they got, it was far too cold to stop for a rest. At about 10 o'clock, the first tiny snowflakes came loitering down and settled on Jill's arm. 10 minutes later, they were falling quite thickly. In 20 minutes, the ground was noticeably white. And by the end of half an hour, a good steady snowstorm, which looked as if it meant to last all day, was driving in their faces so that they could hardly see. In order to understand what followed, you must keep on remembering how little they could see. As they drew near the hill which separated them from the palace, the place where they saw the lighted windows had appeared, they had no general view of it at all. It was a question of seeing the next few paces ahead, and even for that you had to screw up your eyes. Needless to say, they were not talking. When they reached the foot of the hill, they caught a glimpse of what might be rocks on each side. Squarish rocks if you looked at them carefully, but no one did. All were more concerned with the ledge right in front of them, which barred their way. It was about 4 feet high. The marshwiggle with his long legs had no difficulty in jumping onto the top of it, and he then helped the others up. It was a nasty, wet business for them, though not for him, because the snow now lay quite deep on the ledge. Then they had a stiff climb. Jill fell once up a very rough ground for about 100 yards. They came to a second ledge. There were 4 of these ledges altogether at quite irregular intervals. As they struggled up onto the 4th ledge, there was no mistaking the fact that they were now at the top of the flat hill. Up till now, the slope had given them some shelter. Here they got the full fury of the wind. For the hill, oddly enough, was quite as flat on top as it had looked from a distance, a great level tableland which the storm tore across without resistance. In most places the snow was still hardly lying at all, for the wind kept catching it up off the ground in sheets and clouds and hurling it into their faces. And round their feet little eddies of snow ran about as if you see them doing over ice. And indeed, in many places the surface was almost as smooth as ice. But to make matters worse, it was cross and crisscrossed. To make matters worse, it was cross and crisscrossed with curious banks or dikes, which sometimes divided up into squares and oblongs. All these, of course, had to be climbed. They varied from 2 to 5 feet in height and were a couple of yards thick. On the north side of each bank, the snow already lay in deep drifts, and after each climb you came down into a drift and got wet. Fighting her way forward with hood up and head down with numb hands inside her cloak, Jill had glimpses of other odd things on that horrible tableland, things on her right that looked vaguely like factory chimneys, and on her left a huge cliff, straighter than any cliff ought to be. But she wasn't at all interested and didn't give them a thought. The only thing she thought about was her cold feet, her cold hands, and nose and chin and ears, and hot baths and beds at Harfang. Suddenly she slid about 5 feet, and found herself, to her horror, sliding down into a dark, narrow chasm, which seemed at the moment to have appeared in front of her. Half a second later she had reached the bottom. She appeared to be in a kind of a trench or groove, only about 3 feet wide. And though she was shaken by the fall, almost the first thing she noticed was the relief of being out of the wind, for the walls of the trench rose high above her. The next thing she noticed was, naturally, the anxious faces of Scrub and Puddleglum looking down at her from the edge. "Are you hurt, Paul?" shouted Scrub. "Both legs broken, I shouldn't wonder," shouted Puddleglum. Jill stood up and explained that she was all right, but they'd have to help her out. "What is it you've fallen into?" asked Scrub. "It's kind of a trench, or it might be kind of a sunken lane or something," said Jill. "It runs quite straight." "Yes, by Jove," said Scrub, "and it runs due north. I wonder if it's a sort of a road. If it was, we could be out of this infernal wind down there. Is there a lot of snow at the bottom?" "Hardly any. It all blows over the top, I suppose. What happens further on?" "Half a sec. I'll go and see," said Jill. She got up and walked along the trench, but before she had gone far, it turned sharply to the right. She shouted this information back to the others. "What's around the corner?" Now it happened that Jill had the same feeling about twisty passages and dark places underground, or even nearly underground, that Scrub had about the edges of cliffs. She had no intention of going around that corner alone, especially when she heard Puddleglum bawling out from behind her. "Be careful, Pole. It's just the sort of place that might lead to a dragon's cave, and in a giant country there might be giant earthworms or giant beetles." I don't think it goes anywhere much," said Jill, coming hastily back. "I'm jolly well going to have a look," said Scrub. "What do you mean by not anywhere much, I should like to know?" So he sat down on the edge of the trench. Everyone was too wet by now to bother about being a bit wetter, and dropped in. He pushed past Jill, and though he didn't say anything, she felt sure that he knew she had funked it. So she followed him close, but took care not to get in front of him. It proved, however, a disappointing exploration. They went around the right-hand turning and straight on for a few paces. Here there was a choice of ways. Straight on again, or sharp to the right. "That's no good," said Scrub, glancing down the right-hand turn. "That would be taking us back south." He then went on, but once more, in a few steps, he found a second turn to the right. But this time there was no choice of ways, for the trench they had been following here came to a dead end. "No good," grunted Scrub. Jill lost no time in turning and leading the way back. When they returned to the place where Jill had first fallen in, the Marshwiggle with his long arms had no difficulty in pulling them out. But it was dreadful to be out on top again. Down in those narrow slits of trenches their ears had almost begun to thaw. They had been able to see clearly and breathe easily and hear each other speak without shouting. It was absolute misery to come back into the withering coldness, and it did seem hard when Puddleglum chose that moment for saying, "Are you still sure of those signs, Pole? What's the one we ought to be after now?" "Oh, come on, bother the signs," said Jill. Something about someone mentioning Aslan's name, I think, but I'm jolly well not going to give it a recitation here. Yeah, no, it was about obeying the words written on the stone at the lost giant city. As you see, she had got the order wrong. That was because she had given up saying the signs over every night. She still knew them really. She still really knew them, but if she troubled to think, but she no longer was so pat in her lesson as to be sure of reeling them off in the right order at a moment's notice, and without thinking. Puddleglum's question annoyed her because deep down inside of her she was already annoyed with herself for not knowing the lion's lesson quite so well as she felt she ought to have known it. This annoyance, added to the misery of being very cold and tired, made her say, "Bother the signs." She didn't really quite mean it. "Oh, that was next, was it?" said Puddleglum. "Now I wonder, are you right? Got 'em mixed up, I shouldn't wonder. It seems to me this hill, this flat place we're on, is worth stopping to have a look at. Have you noticed?" "Oh, Lord," said Scrub. "Is this a time for stopping to admire the view? For goodness sake, let's get on." "Oh, look, look, look," cried Jill and pointed. Everyone turned and everyone saw. Some way up to the north, a good deal higher up than the tableland on which they stood, a line of lights had appeared. This time even more obviously than when the travelers had seen them the night before. There were windows, smaller windows that made one think deliciously of bedrooms, and larger windows that made one think of great halls with fires roaring in the hearth, and hot soup, or Jersey sirloins, smoking on the table. "Harfang!" exclaimed Scrub. "That's all very well," said Puddleglum, "but what I was saying was—" "Oh, shut up," Jill said crossly. "We haven't a moment to lose. Don't you remember what the lady said about their locking up so early? We must get there in time. We must. We'll die if we shut out here on a night like this." "Well, it isn't exactly a night, not yet," began Puddleglum, but the two children both said, "Come on," and we began stumbling forward on the slippery tableland as quickly as their legs would carry them. The marshwiggle followed them, still talking, but now that they were forcing their way into the wind again, they could not have heard him, even if they'd wanted to. And they didn't want to hear. They were thinking of taking baths and beds and hot drinks, and the idea of coming to Harfang too late and being shut out was almost unbearable. In spite of their haste, it took them a long time to cross the flat top of that hill, and even when they had crossed it, there were still several ledges to climb down on the far side, but at last they reached the bottom and could see what Harfang was like. It stood on a high crag, and in spite of its many towers was a more huge house than a castle. Obviously, the gentle giants feared no attack. There were windows in the outside walls quite close to the ground, a thing no one would have in a serious fortress. There were even odd little doors here and there, so that it would be quite easy to get in and out of the castle without going through the courtyard. This raised the spirits of Jill and Scrub. It made the whole place look more friendly and less forbidding. At first, the height and steepness of the crag frightened them, but presently they noticed that there was an easier way up on the left, and that the road wound up toward it. It was a terrible climb, but after the journey they had nearly had, and Jill nearly gave up. Scrub and Puddleglum had to help her up for the last 100 yards, but in the end they stood before the castle gate. The portcullis was up and the gate was open. However tired you are, to take some nerve to walk up to a giant's front door. In spite of all his previous warnings against Harfang, it was Puddleglum who showed the most courage. "Steady pace now," he said. "Don't look frightened, whatever you do. We've done the silliest thing in the world by coming here at all, but now that we are here, we'd best put a bold face on it." With these words he strode forward into the gateway and stood still under the arch where the echo would help his voice, and called as loud as he could, "Ho, porter, guests who seek lodging." And while he was waiting for something to happen, he took off his hat and knocked off the heavy mass of snow which had gathered on its wide brim. "I say," whispered Scrub to Jill, "he may be a wet blanket, but he has plenty of pluck and cheek." A door opened, letting out a delicious glow of firelight, and the porter appeared. Jill bit her lips for fear she should scream. He was not a perfectly enormous giant. That is to say, he was rather taller than an apple tree, but nothing quite so tall as a telegraph pole. He had bristly red hair, a leather jerkin with metal plates fastened all over it, so as to make kind of a mail shirt, bare knees, very hairy indeed, and things like puttees on his legs. He stooped down and goggled at Puddleglum. "And what sort of creature do you call yourself?" he said. Jill took her courage in both hands. "Please," she said, shouting up at the giant, "the Lady of the Green Kirtle salutes the King of the Gentle Giants, and has sent us us two southern children, and it's Marshwiggle. His name's Puddleglum. To your autumn feast, if it's quite convenient, of course," she added. "Oh ho," said the porter. "That's quite a different story. Come in, little people, come in. You'd best come into the lodge while I'm sending word to His Majesty." He looked at the children with curiosity. "Blue faces," he said. "I didn't know they were that color. Don't care about it myself, but I dare say you look quite nice to each other. Beetles fancy other beetles, they do say." "Our faces are only blue with cold," said Jill. "We're not this color, really." "Come in and get warm. Come in, little shrimps," said the porter. They followed him into the lodge, and though it was rather terrible to hear such a big door clang shut behind them, they forgot about it as soon as they saw the thing that they had been longing for ever since supper last night, a fire. And such a fire, it looked as if 4 or 5 whole trees were blazing in it, and it was so hot they couldn't go within yards of it. But they all flopped down on the brick floor as near to it as they could bear the heat, and heaved great sighs of relief. "Now, youngster," said the porter to another giant who had been sitting in the back of the room, staring at the visitors till it looked as if his eyes would start out of his head, "run across with this message to the house," and he repeated what Jill had said to him. The younger giant, after a final stare and a great guffaw, left the room. "Now, Froggy," said the porter to Puddleglum, "you look as if you wanted some cheering up." He produced a black bottle very much like Puddleglum's, but about 20 times larger. Let me see," said the porter. "I can't give you a cup or you'll drown yourself. Let me see. The salt cellar would be just the thing. You needn't mention it over at the house. The silver will keep on getting over here, but it's not my fault." The salt cellar was not very like one of ours, being narrower and more upright, and made quite a good cup for Puddleglum. When the giant set it down the floor beside him, the children expected Puddleglum to refuse it, distrusting the gentle giants as he did. But he muttered, "It's rather late to be thinking of precautions now that we're inside and the door shut behind us." Then he sniffed at the liquor. "Smells all right," he said, "but that's nothing to go by. Better make sure." Took a sip. "Tastes all right too," he said, "but it might do that the first sip. How does it go on?" He took a larger sip. "Ah," he said, "but it's the same all the way down," and took another sip. "There'll be something nasty at the bottom, I shouldn't wonder," he said, and finished the drink. He licked his lips and remarked to the children, "That'll be a test, you see. If I curl up or burst or turn into a lizard or something, then you'll know that not to take anything they offer you." But the giant, who was too far up to hear the things Puddleglum had been saying under his breath, roared with laughter and said, "Why, Froggy, you're a man. See him put it away." "Not a man, Marshwiggle," replied Puddleglum in a somewhat indistinct voice. "Not Froggy either, Marshwiggle." At that moment the door opened behind them, and the younger giant came in saying they're to go into the throne room at once. The children stood up, but Puddleglum remained sitting and said, "Marshwiggle, Marshwiggle, very respectable Marshwiggle, Respectawiggle." "Show them the way, young un," said the giant porter. "You'd better carry Froggy. He's had a drop more than good for him." "Nothing wrong with me," said Puddleglum. Not frog nothing frog with me. I'm a respectable." But the young giant caught him up by the waist and signed to the children to follow. In this undignified way they crossed the courtyard. Puddleglum held in the giant's fist and vaguely kicking in the air. It certainly looked very much like a frog, but they had little time to notice this, for they soon entered the great doorway of a main castle, both their hearts beating faster than normal. And after pattering along several corridors at a trot to keep up with the giant's paces, the kids found themselves in the light of an enormous room, where lamps glowed and a fire roared on the hearth, and both were reflected from the gilding of roof and cornice. More giants than they could count stood on their left and right, all in magnificent robes, and on 2 thrones at the far end sat 2 huge shapes that appeared to be the king and queen. About 20 feet from the thrones they stopped. Scrub and Jill made an awkward attempt at a bow. Girls are not taught how to curtsy at Experiment House, and the young giant carefully put Puddleglum down on the floor, where he collapsed into a sort of a sitting position. With his long limbs, he looked, to tell the truth, uncommonly like a large spider. I was on the phone with an Amazon rep, and I was talking for a while, and she put her to sleep. I just put myself to sleep reading that. I could close my eyes and go to sleep right here, but I won't do it. I'm going to turn that off first. All right. Good night.